3. This week we're going to be taking a look at the macroeconomic perspective. So the macroeconomic perspective is where we depart from microeconomics and move into some macroeconomic material. What we were looking at in chapters 1, 2, 4, and 5 in the first couple weeks of class really has more of a microeconomic focus. So now we're going to switch gears and move into macroeconomics. And macroeconomics concerns looking at the state of our economy. So do we have a healthy, well-performing economy with strong economic growth, low unemployment, low inflation, and a sustainable balance of trade? Or is our economy suffering? Is it weak? Do we have weak economic growth, high unemployment, high inflation, and an unsustainable balance of trade? So let's take a look at what each of these different things mean. So when we talk about economic growth, we're going to be needing a way to measure economic growth. We'll develop that a little bit in this chapter, but in subsequent chapters we'll talk more about GDP. So we'll use GDP to understand whether we are experiencing economic growth or not. Unemployment is also going to be an entire chapter in this course. When we look at unemployment, you might be aware of the concept of unemployment. There are people who are seeking employment who cannot find work, and those people would be considered unemployed. So we will develop a definition for unemployment, a way to calculate unemployment, and this is the way that the Bureau of Labor Statistics produces our unemployment figures that are used to assess the health of the economy. And we'll also look at ways to deal with increases in unemployment and what really should unemployment look like in a healthy developed economy. So developed economies like the United States versus a developing economy, for example, a country like Mexico might have a different kind of unemployment rate. And inflation is another very important topic. We'll spend an entire chapter looking at inflation. What is inflation? Well, inflation is a general rise in prices, and so we expect to see some general increase in price year over year. But when that increase in price is substantial, or when we have no inflation or no general increase in prices year over year, that might signal some sort of a problem. So when we have an issue with economic growth, or an issue with employment or unemployment statistics, we find something strange in our inflation figures, these might be symptoms of an unhealthy economy. And lastly, we'll look at the balance of trade. So the balance of trade is going to look at our exporting and importing of goods and services. The balance of trade is also going to be concerned with capital flows. We will spend an entire chapter looking at the balance of trade and learning how to assess what is a sustainable balance of trade and what does it mean when we have more that we are exporting, or if we have more that we are importing, how is this going to affect our economy and produce a healthy economy. So these would be the 4 key components of assessing the state of your economy. Now, to be able to study unemployment and inflation and the balance of trade and strong economic growth, we need models. And all of our models will have a framework. We'll be either using aggregate demand and supply model and the Keynesian model within that model and the neoclassical model within that aggregate demand and supply model. So really the Keynesian model and the neoclassical model are different perspectives on how to use aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And when we know these different models and understand what could potentially happen, so say there is an increase in the money supply, according to the Keynesian perspective or the neoclassical perspective, how should this affect aggregate demand? How should this affect aggregate supply? And then we can see, well, what impact should that increase on the money supply have on economic growth, which is changes in our GDP, on unemployment, on inflation, or on our balance of trade. And now, if we are a government policy maker, we would be concerned with either pursuing monetary or fiscal policy. So when I say an increase in the money supply, a decrease in the money supply, an increase in government spending, or a decrease in government spending. I'm talking about monetary policy and fiscal policy. And we'll spend several chapters looking at what is monetary policy and how do we use it within our aggregate demand and supply models. And from a Keynesian or neoclassical perspective, how do increases or decreases in the money supply, and how do we actually increase or decrease the money supply? How does this affect our aggregate demand and supply model, which then has an impact on economic growth, unemployment, inflation, and the balance of trade? Fiscal policy will be the same sort of idea. In fiscal policy, we're going to be looking at, so I'll put here actually for you, changes. So we'll study how to change the money supply and what effect it has on the economy. And in fiscal policy, we'll look at changes in government spending. So government spending could be on schools, it could be on roads, it could be on the military, but any change in government spending or taxation policy. How does this impact our aggregate demand and supply model from a Keynesian or neoclassical perspective? And thus, what are the impacts to economic growth, unemployment, inflation, and the sustainable balance of trade? So unemployment, I'll define that for you again. So the first thing we need to be able to understand before we move on into our next chapter, which it'll be an entire chapter just studying what is economic growth and what does economic growth look like over time. Why do we have economic growth? We have to understand what is called GDP. So this is the gross domestic production. And gross domestic production can be measured from a couple of different perspectives. So gross domestic production being all of the production of final goods and services produced within an economy over a certain period of time. So all of that production year over year should be generally increasing. The value of it should be increasing even if we hold the dollar constant, and that would be our real GDP. And we can measure it by looking at everything that is consumed, everything that is invested, everything that is spent by the government, and instead of invested, I'll put investment, and all of our exports minus our imports. And we would call this the expenditure model. Now, consumption is going to be the spending of consumers. So actually, I'll put this below. On final goods and services. Okay, so this would be households generally. Household spending. And they can buy durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. An investment is going to be done by the business investing community. And what they're going to generally be investing in are capital goods. Investment also occurs in the accumulation of inventories. So because gross domestic production measures the production of spending, so from the expenditure model perspective, which is what we're looking at, it's the spending on final goods and services done by consumers. If businesses are investing in capital goods such as machinery and factories and tools, etc., they also might be accumulating inventories, and so those inventories would be produced in a current year, but they would not yet be sold, so we'll want to include them. And then finally, we also have to include an investment, residential real estate. And so let's make sure we also note that this is new residential real estate. So any real estate which is built in the current year would be considered the production of new residential real estate. So therefore something like a home built in 1980 and sold in 2016 would not be included. Okay. And so all of this is called the expenditure model. So we have our consumption category, we have our investment category, and we also have government expenditures. So the government can do a couple of things. The government can actually make outright purchases, or it can make investment. So this would be considered private investment, but the government also spending which includes public investment. So examples of public investment would be things like roads and education. These are things which the country needs, and the production of them represents an investment in the future. So in education, in our productive capacity of future human abilities, and in roads for perhaps transporting goods and services. And lastly, we have exporting and importing. So from an expenditures perspective, the total value of everything that goes outside of the country to foreigners, and everything that we purchase from foreigners. Notice that any importing that we do, importing will decrease the total GDP. Okay. So our expenditure model of gross domestic production is probably going to be the most straightforward approach. You might see on an exam question saying, for example, if a company is to build a factory in 2014, how will that be counted towards GDP in the year 2014? And you would know that looking at our expenditure model, you wouldn't choose consumption because it's not spending by consumers on final goods and services. You would know that it's not government spending because it's a private company that's doing the spending. You would know it's not exporting or importing because I haven't defined any sort of transactions that are occurring between our country and another country, or another country buying our goods or services. So automatically you would say that if a company was building a factory, we would consider that private investment in capital goods. Okay. So we can also measure all of the production from a production perspective, looking at all of the durable goods which are produced, all of the non-durable goods which are produced, all of the services which are produced, and all of the inventories which are produced. So those goods and services and inventories which are produced would be purchased by consumers, investors, the government, or could be exported, or we would be importing them, which would count against our gross domestic production equation. So this is just another way to look at the total value of production in a year. So the total value of production in a year in and of itself is not extremely meaningful. What we're going to do is over time, we will compare our GDP in one year versus another year to see if there is an increase in production. And so in chapter 8, we'll look at this concept in a lot more depth, but that's just to give you an idea of, well, we're not actually measuring strong economic growth here today when we talk about GDP, but we're building the metric on which we can analyze whether there is strong economic growth from one time period to the next. Another thing we need to do to be able to compare GDP figures is say we're looking at, how does our economy function what does economic growth look like here versus in another economy? So each country has its own currency generally, unless they're pegged to the dollar, which a couple of countries are. But for the most part, we all have our own currencies. And so we need to look at exchange rates and translate the value of GDP in a foreign currency, in a foreign GDP, into US dollars to be able to compare that country's GDP to our own. So let's do an example, and this might be something that you would see on an exam. I might give you the GDP of Brazil. So in the year 2011, the GDP of Brazil was 4,800 billion real. And the exchange rate at the time was 1.976 real to the dollar. So if we want to translate this real figure into dollars, what we need to do is use the exchange rate. So here we have real per dollar, and therefore 4,894 billion real times 1 over 1.976 real per dollar would give us $2,477 billion. But this, remember, is still the GDP of Brazil in 2011. And so why did I put 1 over 1.976 real? So if we have real per dollar, we're basically just doing cross multiplication. If I had the US's GDP in the numerator times this 1.976 real over dollars, then dollar would cancel out, and I would be left with the US GDP in real. However, we want to look at Brazil's GDP, which is in real, in dollars. So if we put real in the denominator and dollars in the numerator, so this would be dollars, $1 per 1.976 real, then we will come up with dollars in the end, and we'll have $2,477 billion, which is the GDP of Brazil in 2011 in dollars. Another thing to take into consideration when comparing the GDP of one country versus another country is that they have different populations. Obviously, there are many characteristics about Brazil that are significantly different from the United States. But the first one we might notice is that the size of the population is drastically different. So shouldn't the expenditures or the production look different also? So what we're going to do is look at our GDP per capita. So we can compare GDPs between countries by looking at the GDP per capita. All we need to do this is, now that we have our GDP figure in dollars, so we might not really understand, well, what does 4.894 billion real buy us? But we do in some sense understand what 2,477 billion real buys us, or 2.4 trillion US dollars. So $2.477 trillion divided by the population of Brazil will give us the dollars per capita of GDP production. Okay, so if we have and then one thing I want to make sure you understand is what we're doing with the decimal points here. So 2,477 billion. That really looks like 2,477. Okay, so we have 100, 100,000, 100 million, 100 billion, trillion. Okay, so I can also call that 2.477 trillion. Cool. So 2.477 trillion divided by the total population of Brazil gives us a GDP per capita of 12.594. So let's do this out. Let's see if my calculator even has the decimal spaces for it. Okay, so we have 100, 100,000, 100 million, 100 billion, trillion. and that gives us $12,573 per capita GDP. Oh, looks like I have this a little wrong in here, so let's fix it. 2477, 100,000, 100 million, 100 billion, 100 trillion, divided by 197. 197 million people in Brazil. So the per capita GDP is $12,573 per person, compared to the United States of a per capita GDP of 48,000 US dollars per year. Okay. So let me know if you have questions about how to compute this. This is another really good example of the type of question that we might have on an exam. Now, GDP doesn't take into consideration a couple of things, right? I mean, we've looked at, well, how do we come up with GDP? We add up all of the spending on consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports in a year. We can also translate different currencies from another country into a home currency so that we can understand what that figure really means. And then we can look at it in per capita terms to see what the distribution sort of kind of looks like per person for the total value of production. But it really doesn't say anything about equality. We don't know how that wealth is actually spread out. We don't know if it's centered around, the top 10 or 20% of the population. We don't know what the bottom 5 to 10% of the population is earning economically per year of that total production. So that's something that we just don't know, and GDP isn't going to tell us a lot about. GDP also doesn't take into account leisure time. So in certain countries, there might be more leisure time available, and that certainly does have a value, and that value is not being accounted for in the GDP figures. So here you might say, well, in the US, we're substantially better off than those on average in Brazil. But we don't know anything about their leisure time. We don't know anything about the productivity of the individual worker. Are workers very productive in the United States? Are workers just not very productive in Brazil? Is that why their GDP per capita is so low? We don't really know. It doesn't really tell us about anything about the country other than the value of production per person, which, here again, it looks like the United States has a very nice GDP per capita relative to that of Brazil, but we don't know about how much education costs in Brazil versus the United States. For example, in the United States, education might be very expensive, and so if the GDP per person is $50,000, but this society is spending a lot of money on education per person, but the society doesn't have to, an individual has access to public education, for example, or it just doesn't cost as much to produce the education, then you don't really need as much to get as far. Other things we don't know about are the environment. A country that has a very high GDP could potentially have a lot of pollution in it, or if they have high growth, there could be substantial pollution, and you see this in developing countries. We don't know anything about the healthcare that's available to people in the country. That's another characteristic of a society that's very, very important for the average individual. The GDP, again, is really just telling us what does the total value of production per person look like in dollars in Brazil versus in the United States. A couple of things GDP isn't taking into account at all are any exchanges that occur in the market that are sort of below, under the table. So there might be lots of trade and barter in certain economies, there might not be in others, and all of that production is not going to be accounted for. Certainly production that occurs which is happening under the table or in the home, that is not going to be accounted for. So in the United States, for example, if people are spending a lot of money on daycare, whereas in Brazil, one of the parents is able to stay home and take care of the child, the value of that person staying home to take care of the child is not being accounted for here, but it is being accounted for here. And so it might really be overstating the benefit of the higher GDP per capita for the United States versus Brazil. And Something else that I really want to bring up, even though there are a couple of points, it doesn't include secondhand production, anything that is previously produced but then purchased again. A really important point is that GDP increases aren't always a good thing. So in war times, or if there's some sort of natural disaster, we do oftentimes see substantial increases in GDP that represent consumption that needs to happen or investment that needs to happen on things that are destroyed or being destroyed, or for things that might not necessarily benefit the economy in the long run. We don't want to get into too much of a philosophical discussion about war not benefiting in the long run, but just the general idea that spending tends to increase in war times. It might tend to increase when there's a natural disaster. And these types of increases in GDP are not necessarily a good thing. So what I would say is that with GDP, when we're looking at economic growth, which we've kind of gotten, a little bit of a better understanding of by understanding, what is our gross domestic production look like. We need to really understand the story behind changes in GDP. And in our next chapter, we're going to do that. We're going to put these figures into historical context for the United States over time, since we've basically been capturing these statistics. And we're going to look at what does our growth look like? Why has the economy expanded or contracted as it has over the years? So I will look forward to seeing you next week. I wish you the best of luck on the quiz, and please contact me if you have any questions about this lecture or how to respond in the discussion forum.